They did not come home to a funeral, they came home to a gift shop. That was the detail Amara Osei kept returning to in the 60 hours before translation lock. Not the fleet, not the silence from Saul, but the item that had turned up in the Concord's public registry 3 days into their approach, a commemorative fragment, authenticated, offered at auction, harvested from a structure the registry listed only as human coastal settlement, designation unknown, extinct. Somewhere a piece of someone's home had a price and a certificate. The Directorate's first transmission arrived 4 hours after the second horizon crossed the outer marker buoys, and it was polite in the specific way that only 500 years of institutional practice can make polite. It did not ask who they were. It informed them in flawless pre-war human standard that they were in violation of Preserve Statute 4, subsection 12. Unauthorized vessels are prohibited within the Saul Memorial exclusion boundary, and that continued approach would be logged as a heritage site incursion. Amara read it twice in the archive bay, then a third time out loud to Elder Bonsu, because she wanted to hear whether it sounded as absurd spoken as it did written. It did. They filed us, Bonsu said. He was 91, the oldest continuity officer the ship had ever carried, and he said it the way a man notices a stain he has been staring past for years. We are not intruders to them. We are paperwork. The second transmission, 12 hours later, came with an attachment. An itemized visitor's guide to the Saul Preserve, translated helpfully into human standard as though the gesture were a courtesy rather than a taunt. Under a heading titled Points of Historical Interest was a schematic of the old Lagrange shipyards, the yards where, 5 centuries ago, the second horizon had been laid down in the war's final desperate month, annotated with a small icon indicating gift concession availability. Undersecretary Velkalaith IX introduced himself on the 14th hour, and he did it smiling. Oswin faces were not built for human expression, but 500 years of contact had taught them how to arrange themselves into something a human eye would read as warmth, and Kalaith IX had clearly practiced. He thanked the second horizon for what he called this deeply moving act of remembrance, expressed the Directorate's sympathy for the descendants of a species he called dignified in its ending, and requested with unbroken courtesy that the vessel hold position at the marker buoys pending a full heritage review, a review, he noted, that could take as little as 11 months. He did not ask if there were survivors aboard. He had already decided the answer, and decided it 5 centuries ago, filed it, and moved on. There was a silence on the bridge after the transmission ended that lasted longer than any silence in Amara's memory. Then Captain Iyabo Osei, no relation to Amara, an unhelpful coincidence they had stopped explaining to each other around the 200th ship year, turned in her chair and said, "Get me the registrar." Amara was already standing. She had spent 411 ship years. She'd done the calculation once and never repeated it, because the number made her hands go still, maintaining the continuity archive. An unbroken chain of birth records, succession law, cultural transmission logs, and genetic lineage certifications, built for exactly one purpose: proving, if it was ever needed, that the people aboard this ship were not a new thing that had grown up in the dark. They were the same thing that had left. Everyone on the ship treated the archive as a kind of grief work, a monument nobody expected to use. Amara had never quite believed that. She had built it like a woman building a door, not a wall. "They think we're relics," she said, when Iyabo asked what she needed. "So we're going to be the most well-documented relics in conquered history. Get me a channel to the Directorate, not Kalaith IX, his archivist." It was not a rallying line. She said it the way she said everything, flatly, already 3 steps into the logistics of it, and it took Bonsu a full second to understand what she meant, and when he did, he sat down heavily in the chair beside the archive console, because his legs had stopped agreeing with the rest of him. "You're not going to argue that we're alive," he said. "They can see our life signs, that's not in dispute." Amara was already pulling the first folio. "I'm going to argue that we never stopped being legally alive. That's a different fight, and it's the one we can win with paper instead of guns." Chief Engineer Tomas Reyes had grown up being told, by 3 separate ship generation engineering instructors, that the Second Horizon's primary drive core was an inelegant compromise, a patchwork of pre-war salvage bolted around a modern regulator because nobody, in the desperate final month of the evacuation, had time to build something properly new. He had believed it his whole career the way a person believes the weather. He stopped believing it 11 hours before the rededication countdown began, staring at a licensing manifest that had come through on the Open Preserve channel as part of the Directorate's public transparency requirement, a requirement Kalaith IX clearly assumed no one would ever actually read. The manifest listed among 400 years of licensed memorial salvage, a category, propulsion fragments non-functional decorative only, serial tagged, cross-referenced. An identical component for component, tolerance for tolerance, to the drive housing schematic bolted into the Second Horizon's own engine bay. Reyes did not say anything for 11 seconds. Then he sat down on the deck plating because it seemed like the honest thing to do with his body while his mind caught up. They didn't strip the ships that got left behind, he said, when he could talk again. They stripped the yards. The parts we built this engine from, the parts our own great-great-grandparents pulled out of scrap piles because nothing else was flying, those weren't scrap. Those were working military drive components. The Directorate cataloged them as non-functional because functional pre-war human tech wasn't in their threat model. Extinct species don't get threat models. He looked up at Amara. Our engine isn't a patchwork. It's a warship's heart wearing a civilian ship's clothes. They handed it to us for free because they didn't know what it was. Dr. Priya Nair's discovery came from the other direction entirely, not the ship looking outward, but the ship looking at itself. The Continuity Archive held, among 4 centuries of birth and succession law, a set of documents nobody aboard had opened in generations. The original evacuation logs, written in the final panicked weeks by officers who had known they were leaving, and not known if anyone would ever read what they left behind. Nair had gone looking for genetic baseline records to strengthen the continuity claim. She found something else first, a minefield chart, hand-annotated. The full disposition of every autonomous defense mine the pre-war Sol Defense Authority had seeded through the approach corridors in the war's last desperate season, mines built to be silent, non-emitting, and lethal to anything without the correct passive key. The Directorate's own approach lanes, established 200 years into the preserve's operation, ran directly through what this chart showed as an active field. They think the corridors are clear, Nair said, very quietly, into the silence of the archive bay. They've been flying pleasure yachts and salvage haulers through there for 2 centuries because nobody ever found a chart. We have the chart, and we have the key. She held up a small data spindle, its housing so old it had been recased twice by hand. It's in the evacuation logs attached hardware manifest. It was never lost, it was just never needed. Elder Bonsu's discovery was the quietest of the 3, and in the end, the one that mattered most. He had been cross-referencing the Directorate's own founding charter, a document the Concord itself required member species to accept, guaranteeing every catalogued extinct species a mandatory 500-year mourning moratorium before any heritage asset could be permanently transferred. No exceptions, no early licensing, under any administration. He found the first violation on page 2 of the Directorate's public transparency filing. A licensing transaction, dated 461 years after the Extinction Declaration, 39 years before the moratorium's own 500-year floor. He found the second violation on page 4, then the third. By the time he stopped counting, there were 61. They've been selling us early for a century, Bonsu said. He did not sit down this time. He went very still instead, the way a man goes still when he has found something too large to hold sitting down. Calaith 9 didn't just administer the preserve, he personally authorized 11 of these. His own charter, broken in his own hand, filed under his own name, because he never imagined the file would end up in front of the people it was written about. Amara took the list from him without a word and began cross-indexing it against every other conquered member species with a heritage-protected extinction record of their own, of which the Charter's own registry showed there were 41. 41 species who might, on hearing this, understand exactly what had just happened to humanity, because it had very nearly happened to them. The rededication was scheduled for the 6th day, timed. Amara now understood with a cold, specific clarity, not by coincidence but by design, to close the moratorium and open the last unlicensed human assets to permanent commercial transfer before any inconvenient survivors could possibly arrive to object. The Directorate had built its own deadline around an extinction it had never bothered to verify. Calaith 9's second personal transmission arrived on the 4th day, still smiling, still courteous, and this time carrying an actual ultimatum dressed as an invitation. The Second Horizon would be permitted to attend the rededication as an honored observer, a single seat, unarmed, non-voting, provided it withdrew to the outer marker buoys immediately and remained there under preserve escort until the ceremony concluded. "He's not trying to keep us out of the system," Reyes said, reading it over Amara's shoulder. "He's trying to keep us out of the record. If we're not present and objecting when the moratorium closes, the transfer goes through clean. No survivors on file, no dispute filed, just a ceremony in a gift shop." Amara's response to the deadline was not fear, it was acceleration. 6 days, she said. We don't need 6 days. We need to be inside broadcast range of the full Concord relay network before the ceremony opens, with the charter violations, the drive manifest, and the continuity record all packaged and ready to transmit the moment we're heard. We're not planning to win a fight. We're planning to be impossible to ignore at exactly the right moment. The Preserve's patrol wing met them at the edge of the exclusion boundary on the 6th day, 11 hours before rededication, 4 light corvettes built for exactly one purpose: intercepting looters trying to strip memorial wrecks for black market salvage. They were fast. They were armed for that purpose and no other. They had never once, in 2 centuries of service, been asked to stop a lawful vessel with a legitimate claim and a 500-year-old chart of a minefield their own navigators didn't know existed. The corvettes moved to block the Second Horizon's vector at 19 minutes past the deadline for voluntary withdrawal. Calaith 9 voice came through, still even, still unhurried, informing the ship that further advance would be treated as a heritage site incursion and met with proportional response. Yabo Osa answered with 4 words: "We're going home." Then Nair fed the minefield chart to navigation, and Rays brought the drive the Directorate had itself declared non-functional, decorative only. Up past every rated tolerance the Second Horizon's own engineers had spent 4 centuries believing was the ceiling. The corvettes followed the Second Horizon into the corridor. The Second Horizon followed the chart. 12 minutes in, the lead corvette clipped the edge of a minefield node its sensors had never been tuned to detect, took a warning strength proximity discharge across its shields, and peeled off hard, its navigator finally, belatedly, requesting the same chart data the humans had been flying by for the last quarter hour. The Directorate had spent 2 centuries flying pleasure craft through a live minefield and calling the corridor clear. It took 1 warning shot from a 500-year-old mine for a Concord navigator to admit, over open channel, that he did not actually know what was in front of him. The remaining 3 corvettes did not clip anything. Their captain, to her credit, adapted fast. She pulled her formation wide, matched the Second Horizon's vector from a flanking approach that avoided the charted nodes entirely, and for 4 minutes it was a genuine pursuit, close enough that Rays reported hull proximity alarms on 2 separate occasions. It ended not in a kill but in a threshold. At the 9-minute mark, the Second Horizon crossed into full relay range of the Concord's own communication backbone, the network the Directorate itself maintained, open by charter to any registered heritage claim, and Amara transmitted everything. The charter violations, the drive manifest, the 4-century unbroken continuity record, the genetic baseline, Bonsu's list of 61 illegal transfers, cross-tagged to the 40 other extinct classified species who shared the same charter protection. She did not transmit it quietly. She transmitted it to the same public channel Calaith 9 had used to send them a gift shop schematic. The pursuing corvettes broke off 11 minutes before the rededication was due to open, not because they had lost the chase, but because their own Directorate had just gone very, very quiet on the command channel, and a captain with 2 centuries of institutional instinct knows exactly what that silence means. The corridor run had lasted 19 minutes and 40 seconds. No shots were fired that struck a target. The battle had never been about firepower. It had been about who understood the ground they were standing on, and the Directorate had built its entire preserve on ground it had never actually surveyed. Calaith 9 official statement came within the hour, and it was exactly what Amara had expected. Procedural, careful, already reframing the incursion as a jurisdictional review in progress, already distancing the Directorate from its own 61 transfers with the specific bloodless language of an institution protecting itself. His personal transmission came 4 hours later, unlisted, unscheduled, addressed to her by name. There was a silence before he spoke, a real one, not a diplomatic pause, the kind of silence Amara recognized because she had heard Bonsu make the same one when he found the first violation. "I built the visitor's guide myself," Calaith 9 said finally. "The gift concession schematic. I chose the phrase dignified in its ending. I believed it was respectful." Another pause. "I did not imagine anyone would ever read our files back to us. That was, I understand now, the failure, not the licensing, the certainty that no one was left who could object." He did not apologize for the transfers. He was Oswin, and 500 years of administering grief as a bureaucratic category had trained something out of him that Amara suspected he could not simply decide to grow back in an afternoon. But he used the word she had been listening for, the one she had told Bonsu days earlier that she expected to hear if the charter forced his hand at all. "It was audacious," he said, returning. "I want you to know I mean that as I would mean it about my own people. I did not think a species I had already mourned could still be audacious. We didn't stop being anything, Amara said. You just stopped checking. The rededication did not happen that day or that year. The 40 other extinction-classified member species, once alerted, did not treat the charter violations as humanity's problem alone. They treated them correctly, as a precedent that could just as easily be turned on their own catalog dead, and the Concord's Heritage Directorate spent the following 11 months under an oversight review it had never once, in 5 centuries, expected to face. Amara did not attend most of the hearings. She had never been the ship's advocate in a room. She was its keeper of record, and the record, once transmitted, did the arguing on its own. What she did in the weeks after the corridor run was begin drafting the next document, not a defense this time, but a claim. A full accounting of 5 centuries of licensed salvage, itemized, valued, cross-referenced against the Directorate's own transaction logs, attached to a formal request. Not vengeance, not even apology, retroactive title. Every fragment sold as memorial curiosity, returned or repaid. Every wreck licensed as scrap, reclassified as sovereign property. And beneath all of it, in the section she wrote last, the request that mattered most, formal recognition that the Sol system was not a preserve to be visited. It was a home, still owned, by people who had never actually left it in any way that counted. She was still working on the appendices when Rays found her in the archive bay, 3 days after the corvettes had broken off, the drive core finally cooling from a run it had not been rated for and had survived anyway. You've been at this since the transmission, he said. The fight's basically won, Amara, you can rest. I know, she said, and did not look up from the folio. I've been thinking about the resettlement filing since the 9th minute of the corridor run. He laughed once, disbelieving. She didn't. Behind her, on the small display she kept above the archive console, the one thing in the room that wasn't paperwork, the Second Horizon's long-range feed had finally resolved a clear image of what lay at the center of the system they were coming home to. Earth unclaimed by anyone who had actually stood on it in 500 years, waiting the way a door waits for someone to finally open it. She saved the appendix and started the next one.